As we continue through our study of the book of Luke, we've now reached the point in our study where we begin to look at the death of Jesus. Luke chapter 22, verses 39 through chapter 23 and verse 12 will be the first part of our study that really takes a look at this. Jesus had spent several days in Jerusalem, and during this time, he taught in the temple and spent time with his disciples, particularly in observing the Passover. He's also worked to prepare his disciples for what was about to happen. And we want to begin looking at that now in this lesson as we begin here in Luke chapter 22 and verse 39. Let's look at Jesus' prayer and arrest at Gethsemane. We're going to begin by reading Luke 22, verses 39 through 53. It says, He went out and made his way as usual to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he told them, Pray that you may not fall into temptation. Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and began to pray. Father, if you are willing, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. Then an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. Being in anguish, he prayed more fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. When he got up from prayer and came to the disciples, he found them sleeping, exhausted from their grief. Why are you sleeping? He asked them. Get up and pray so that you won't fall into temptation. While he was still speaking, suddenly a mob came, and one of the 12, named Judas, was leading them. He came near Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those around him saw what was going to happen, they asked, Lord, should we strike with the sword? Then one of them struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. But Jesus responded, No more of this. And touching his ear, he healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, temple police, and the elders who had come for him, Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a criminal? Every day while I was with you in the temple, you never laid a hand on me. But this is your hour and the dominion of darkness. We see in this text, as we start looking at verses 39 through 46 specifically, that Jesus and his disciples went to the Mount of Olives. John chapter 18 and verse 1. This is about half a mile from Jerusalem. You can also see Matthew 26, verses 36 to 46, and Mark 14, verses 32 through 42. Now, this is a place where Jesus often spent time, and he often spent time there with his disciples. Luke 21, verse 37, and John 18, verse 2 demonstrate that. Jesus entered this garden called Gethsemane, and he took Peter, James, and John further than the other disciples, Matthew 26, verses 36 and 37. And he urged them to pray that they would not fall into temptation. Matthew 6, verse 13, Jesus taught people to pray in that sort of way. Pray to help in the great trials that would be coming, that their faith wouldn't be destroyed, perhaps, and the temptations to do what is wrong and displeasing to God through the things that were about to happen would probably be the likely implications of what Jesus has just taught them. And Jesus went about a stone's throw from them, knelt down, and prayed. And he prayed very fervently that the cup of suffering and the cup of sorrow that he was about to drink might be taken away from him. Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen. He had told them even what was going to happen. And Jesus' prayer, I believe, is that there might be another way that would be provided to make atonement for sin. That this cup that had been prepared, that was going to take place, would be taken from him. Yet Jesus also prayed. He didn't just pray that, but he prayed for God's will to be done and expressed his commitment to obey the Father. Even if this wasn't going to happen and this cup wouldn't be taken away from him, that God's will would be done. Philippians 2, verses 5 through 11. And then we see an angel appeared to him and to strengthen him. We see this on another occasion in Matthew chapter 4 and in verse 11, as Jesus had been tempted as well. And Jesus prayed even more, even more fervently in his anguish. So much so that his sweat was like drops of blood. Now, there's discussion about, is this metaphorical? And Jesus is just sweating so heavily that it looks like drops of blood pouring out from him. Maybe that was the case. Or maybe Luke, who was a physician, takes note of this for us, that this was maybe literal, that there is a medical condition that has been documented that is brought on by extreme stress, where blood actually, it basically, you are like sweating blood. It's called hematidrosis. But regardless of which one, we see the anguish of Jesus, where this is how Luke describes the sweat of Jesus. And Jesus prayed and interacted with the disciples 3 times, finding them asleep each time, exhausted from their grief. But Jesus urged them to get up and pray that they would not fall into temptation, indicating that the willingness of the flesh, the weakness of the spirit, Matthew 26, verse 41. And they needed to pray. They needed to be watchful about what was about to happen. In verses 47 then through 53, as Jesus was still speaking to his disciples, Judas led an armed mob to arrest him. You can read Matthew 26, verse 47 through 56, and Mark 14, verses 43 through 52. And this mob included chief priests, scribes, Pharisees, elders, temple police, and soldiers. Mark 14, verse 43, John 18, verse 3. You could look at those passages as well. Now, Judas, of course, who's leading this mob, he knew Jesus spent time in this place. Remember, he again had been one of the 12. And he knew Jesus spent time in this place with his disciples, and he found Jesus away from the people. John 18 and verse 2 helps us to see that Judas knew all of this. Remember, the Jewish leaders were afraid of the people, but now they're able to arrest Jesus away from the people. And Jesus identified himself as Jesus of Nazareth and urged that his disciples would be let go, according to John 18, verses 4 through 9. Well, Judas then he performed the agreed upon sign of a kiss, Matthew 26, verses 48 through 49. And Jesus asked Judas about betraying the Son of Man with a kiss. Seeing that they had come to arrest Jesus' disciples asked if they should fight. And Peter cut off the high priest's servant's right ear. However, Jesus rebuked them. Go read. It's a beautiful passage in Matthew 26, verses 52 through 54, and John 18 and verse 11. Jesus knew that it had to happen this way, and that his kingdom wasn't of this world, so that his soldiers would fight. It wasn't what the point was. It had to happen this way so the scriptures could be fulfilled. And he healed the man's ear. And Jesus asked the mob why they came to arrest him as a criminal, despite the fact he had been with them every day in the temple without being arrested. Yet this was now their hour. It was an hour that belonged to the darkness of Satan. Mark 14 and verse 49. From there, we notice that Jesus then goes before the Sanhedrin. Luke chapter 22, verses 54 through 71. It says, they seized him, led him away, and brought him into the high priest's house. Meanwhile, Peter was following at a distance. They lit a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, and Peter sat among them. When a servant saw him sitting in the light and looked closely at him, she said, this man was with him too. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him. After a little while, someone else saw him and said, you're one of them too. Man, I am not, Peter said. About an hour later, another kept insisting this man was certainly with him, since he's also a Galilean. Peter said, man, I don't know what you're talking about. Immediately, while he was still speaking, a rooster crowed. Then the Lord turned and looked at Peter. So Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. The men who were holding Jesus started mocking and beating him. After blindfolding him, they kept asking, prophesy, who was it that hit you? And they were saying many other blasphemous things to him. When daylight came, the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the scribes, convened and brought him before their Sanhedrin. They said, if you are the Messiah, tell us. But he said to them, if I do tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. They all asked, are you then the Son of God? And he said to them, you say that I am. Why do we need any more testimony, they said, since we've heard it ourselves from his mouth? In verses 54 through 62 of this reading, we see that Jesus was arrested and all the disciples fled. Matthew 26, verse 56. And Jesus was brought before Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest, and the Sanhedrin, which was the highest Jewish council, and brought before them that night. And you can go read Matthew 26, verse 57 and 59, Mark 14, verses 53 and 55, John 18, verses 12 to 14, as well as verses 19 through 24, and put all of the different pieces together to see the unity of the scriptures and the things that happened to Jesus that night. Peter, though, followed Jesus from a distance, along with another disciple. In John chapter 18, verse 15. He followed at a distance to see what would happen. And he followed into the high priest's courtyard. Matthew 26, verses 69 through 75. Mark 14, verses 66 to 72. John 18, verses 15 through 18. And verses 25 through 27. Sitting around a fire with others in the middle of the courtyard, a servant girl of the high priest looked closely at Peter and said he was with Jesus. But Peter denied it. And according to Mark 14, verse 16, we see that a rooster crowed. Remember, Mark mentions Jesus saying that the rooster would crow twice. A short time later, apparently at least 3 people, if you look at Matthew 26, verse 71, and Mark 14, verse 69, and John 18, verse 25, along with Luke's account, joined together to question Peter as being one of Jesus's disciples. Yet he denied knowing what they were talking about. Then, about an hour later, another, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, John 18, verse 26, was insistent in accusing that Peter was with Jesus, being identified as a Galilean by his accent, Matthew 26, verse 73. Well, once more, Peter adamantly denied Jesus. Before he finished speaking, a rooster crowed. And Jesus, who was visible to Peter at that particular moment in time, turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said about previously about him denying Jesus. Luke 22, verses 31 to 34. And Peter then went outside and wept bitterly. In Luke chapter 22, verses 63 to 65, we see Jesus had been taken before Annas and then was led to Caiaphas, where the Sanhedrin convened overnight. John 18, verse 12 to 14, and verses 19 through 24, and Matthew 26, verses 57 through 68. And through this period, Jesus was mocked and beaten. Luke records Jesus being blindfolded and mocked to say who hit him, along with many other blasphemous things. Go read Matthew 26, verses 67 to 68, and Mark 14, verse 65. Well, as we come on into Luke 22, verses 66 through 71, then, we see that after daybreak, Jesus was again brought before the Sanhedrin, consisting of elders, chief priests, and scribes. Again, this is the highest Jewish court. And the Sanhedrin had to wait until daybreak to legally assemble and condemn Jesus to death, as I understand it. Well, they asked Jesus to tell them if he was the Messiah, to incriminate himself. Well, Jesus said they would not believe him and would not answer if he asked them. So he told them the Son of Man would be seated at the right hand of the power of God from now on, which affirmed him as the Messianic King. Go read Daniel 7, verses 9 through 11, and Acts 2, verses 32 through 36. The prophecy and then the fulfillment in Jesus of this. They understood Jesus was claiming to be the Son of God who would sit at God's right hand, implying his divinity. And they asked him about such. But Jesus did not incriminate himself. Instead, he replied that they claimed such. They now concluded they had sufficient evidence of blasphemy to have Jesus killed. Leviticus 24 and verse 16 in particular demonstrates this place of blasphemy and how this was something that would be a capital offense among the Old Testament law. And so all of these things, Jesus has been through that night already, and we have seen the betrayal of Judas. We have seen his apostles flee. We have seen Peter deny him just as Jesus had foretold. We've seen him being brought before the Jewish leaders and ultimately the Sanhedrin, and now being the conclusion having been reached that they had sufficient evidence of blasphemy that Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, would be put to death. Now, as we go into the final section of this lesson, let's look at Luke chapter 23. And we want to start in verse 1 through verse 12 to kind of close out this first part of Luke's record concerning Jesus' death and all these things that Jesus has been going through. And again, you can look at all of the references to the other gospel records as well that also tell the story, and each one kind of adding a few details that are not supplied by the others. Luke 23, verses 1 through 12. Then their whole assembly rose up and brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation, opposing payment of taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." So Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him, "You say so." Pilate then told the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no grounds for charging this man." But they kept insisting. He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he started even to here. When Pilate heard this, he asked if the man was a Galilean. Finding that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem during those days. Herod was very glad to see Jesus. For a long time, he had wanted to see him because he had heard about him and was hoping to see some miracle performed by him. So he kept asking him questions, but Jesus did not answer him. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod, with his soldiers, treated him with contempt, mocked him, dressed him in bright clothing, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Previously, they had been enemies. So, as we start looking at this final section of this lesson, again, thinking about all that Jesus has already been through from the Jews, and the Jews had concluded, at least the Jewish leaders had concluded, that Jesus was deserving of death, guilty of blasphemy. And so, by their law, Jesus, at least their interpretation of the situation, how they were twisting things, Jesus was guilty. Of course, Jesus was not guilty. He hadn't done any of those things. He was only stating the truth in who he was. In chapter 23, verses 1 through 5, as we start looking at Jesus before Pilate and Herod Antipas, we see that Jesus was taken to the Roman governor of Judea, who was Pontius Pilate. You can also see Matthew 27, verses 1 and 2, as well as Mark 15, verses 1 through 5, and John 18, verses 28 through 38. Well, seeing that Jesus was condemned, Luke does not record, but we see in the Gospel of Matthew, for example, that Judas was remorseful. You can think about everything Judas had seen while he was with Jesus, and now he was contributing to Jesus and his arrest, and now ultimately to him being handed over to be put to death. And he was remorseful, and he returned the silver, but he hanged himself. Matthew 27, verses 3 through 5. The Sanhedrin accused Jesus before Pilate of misleading their nation, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar, and claiming he is the Messiah, which meant he is king. You see, they knew the charges would have to be substantial for Pilate to put Jesus to death, and frankly, that it wouldn't just be a matter of their law, that would be required. And so you can see their efforts to try to paint Jesus as being guilty of death under their standards. Of course, Jesus had not done these things in the misleading, nor that he opposed the payment of taxes to Caesar. In fact, what we find Jesus teaching was exactly the opposite of that. He did claim to be king, but not in the way that they're trying to paint it. Pilate asked Jesus specifically about that charge of him being the king of the Jews. And Jesus' answer indicated that it was true, but he stated the spiritual nature of his kingdom. You can go read about that in John 18, verses 33 through 38. So it's not as if he's trying to build this kingdom that is contrary to Rome or something like that, that's going to be a threat to overthrow Rome and those sorts of politically focused and earthly focused natures of the kingdom. But instead, his is a spiritual kingdom that he's been teaching about all along, that even the Jewish people had not understood. Pilate then announced before the chief priests and the crowd that he found no grounds for charging Jesus. But this did not suffice the Jews, as they kept insisting that he had stirred up the people in his teaching throughout Judea and Galilee. And mentioning Galilee leads us into the next section there of verses 6 through 12. Because as Pilate hears that Jesus was a Galilean, and Herod Antipas, who was tetrarch of Galilee and Perea, was in Jerusalem at that time. Again, this is the time of the Passover. And Pilate hears these things. And so Pilate then apparently thought he had a solution to pass the situation on to Herod, for Herod to deal with. Now, Herod was glad to see Jesus, wanting to see him for a long time due to what he had heard about Jesus, and hoping to see some miracle performed. But despite Herod's asking questions, Jesus did not answer. And that's in the fulfillment of prophecy. You can go to Isaiah chapter 53, and you can look at verse 7. In fact, just read all of Isaiah 53, but especially there in verse 7, that he didn't open his mouth. Right? He wasn't giving a defense for himself to get himself off. Could Jesus have proven all of it of his innocence? Could Jesus have brought about his own release? He absolutely could at any part of all of this. But he didn't answer. The Jewish leaders were also making forceful accusations against Jesus. Now, getting no answers from Jesus, Herod and his soldiers had Jesus treated with contempt, mocked, and dressed in bright clothing. Perhaps that indicates expensive, luxurious clothing for the purpose of mocking. Again, remember, Jesus is King of the Jews, not in the way that the Jews are thinking, not in the way that these other people are thinking, but in a spiritual way, and maybe having him clothed in those kinds of clothing for mocking him as king in this way. Herod then sent Jesus back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate, interestingly, in this passage tells us at the very end of this record that day that Herod and Pilate became friends, though they had previously been enemies. And so there's something about this that had brought them together, or at least provided opportunity for that. But you think about Jesus as he's before these two rulers. And Jesus, again, could have affected his own release at any moment, but he didn't. As we close this lesson, we see that the time for everything Jesus had foretold was now. Everything that has been leading has we've been leading up to through Jesus's teachings, through Jesus's foretelling of what was about to happen in Jerusalem. Now it was time. These things, these wheels have been in motion, and now it's in effect. He had now been arrested, betrayed, denied, and forsaken. He had also been falsely accused, mocked, and beaten. Despite his innocence, Jesus was on his way to being put to death.